March 1999. A courtroom in Washington, D.C. Microsoft is fighting for its life in the biggest antitrust trial the tech industry has ever seen. A case that will eventually accuse the company of running the most complete software monopoly in American history. And in the middle of it, on a break from the legal war, Bill Gates is out promoting his own best-selling book. A reporter asks him about a strange little operating system that a community of volunteer programmers keeps giving away for free, and Gates answers without hesitation. He argues that this scrappy, open-source project has no real chance against Windows, that it will always offer less functionality, and that without a single company steering its development, it will always be fragmented, always be behind, always be a hobbyist's toy instead of a serious business tool. The operating system he was talking about was Linux. 27 years later, that same operating system runs the majority of the world's web servers. It powers billions of Android phones. It quietly runs a huge share of the cloud computing that Microsoft's own business now depends on for revenue. And in the summer of 2026, for the first time in over a decade, it is chewing into Windows on the one battlefield Gates specifically said it would never win: the desktop computer sitting in front of ordinary people. This is the story of how the richest, most successful software executive in history made a confident bet about what Windows would always be, and how year after year, decision after decision, the world quietly proved him wrong. To understand why this prediction actually matters and why it's not just a cheap gotcha clip, you have to understand exactly who was making it and exactly how much winning streak he was standing on. By 1999, Bill Gates wasn't simply a successful software executive. He was arguably the single most dominant figure in the entire history of personal computing. Windows ran on something close to 9 out of every 10 personal computers on the planet. Microsoft Office had already crushed WordPerfect, and Lotus 1-2-3, the word processor and spreadsheet programs that had once defined the entire category. Internet Explorer was in the process of strangling Netscape's browser, the product that had basically invented the mainstream web browser market only a few years earlier. Gates had built something close to the most complete technology monopoly the American economy had ever produced, so dominant and so aggressive that the Department of Justice, joined by a coalition of 20 state governments, had decided the only remaining option was to try to break the company apart entirely. And here is the part that matters most for this story. Gates wasn't just powerful, he was usually right. This is a man who correctly bet, years before most of the industry caught on, that the operating system, not the physical hardware, was where the real long-term money in computing would live, a bet that let Microsoft dominate a market IBM had essentially handed to it. He correctly bet that a graphical mouse-driven interface would beat command-line computing for the mass consumer market. He outnegotiated IBM, outpriced Apple during its weakest years, outexecuted Netscape in the first real browser war, and outlasted almost every serious competitor that had ever tried to challenge Windows directly. By any reasonable measure, betting against Bill Gates in 1999 was not the safe position. It was the desperate one. And so when he was asked about Linux, this free, community-built operating system that a Finnish university student named Linus Torvalds had started as a personal side project less than a decade earlier, Gates didn't hedge his answer or offer a cautious, diplomatic non-answer the way most executives do when asked about a small competitor. He argued plainly that Windows offered far more functionality and features than Linux ever would, and his reasoning was specific, not vague corporate spin. He pointed to the lack of what he called a central point of control. Without one company steering the whole project, he argued, open-source software would inevitably fragment into competing, incompatible versions, and it would always lack the polish, the driver, support, and the enterprise-grade protections that real businesses actually needed to run their operations on it. In his framing, free wasn't really free. It came with a hidden cost, and that cost was chaos instead of coordination. It's worth pausing here to say plainly that this was not a crazy argument in 1999. It was, if anything, the consensus view among most industry analysts of the era. Linux really was rough around the edges at that point in its life. Installing it typically meant editing configuration files by hand, wrestling with hardware that had no official driver support, and accepting an interface that looked like it had been designed by and for programmers because it mostly had been. Desktop Linux in any form an ordinary non-technical person could actually sit down and use comfortably, barely existed. If you had walked into that Washington courtroom in 1999 and told anyone there that this hobbyist project would eventually threaten Windows on the consumer desktop, most people in the room, including plenty of Microsoft's harshest critics, would have told you that you were the one who didn't understand the market. But predictions about technology are never judged fairly in the year they're made. They're judged decades later, once all the downstream consequences nobody could have modeled yet have finally played out. And that's exactly what happened here. start with the part of the computing world that never gets talked about on camera but quietly runs almost everything, the server. Today, Linux doesn't just compete with Windows Server for that market, it dominates it in a way that would have seemed absurd to suggest in 1999. The overwhelming majority of the busiest websites on Earth, by most independent measurements, run on Linux-based infrastructure. Every time you load a search engine, stream a video, check a bank balance online, or scroll through a social feed, there's a very good chance that somewhere behind the scenes, a Linux machine is doing the actual work of serving that page to your screen. The central point of control that Gates worried Linux lacked never stopped it from becoming the invisible backbone of the modern internet. It just meant that no single company, least of all Microsoft, got to own that backbone. Then there's the cloud, which is really just servers at a scale nobody in 1999 could have imagined, and it's arguably the most ironic twist in this entire story. Azure, Microsoft's own flagship cloud computing platform, and now one of the company's largest sources of revenue, runs an enormous share of its own virtual machines on Linux rather than Windows. Let that sit for a moment because it's worth repeating slowly. The company Bill Gates built now rents out Linux computing power to its own customers as one of the core pillars of its modern business, not because Microsoft suddenly fell in love with open source out of nostalgia, but because that is what the market and its enterprise customers actually demanded. The operating system Gates dismissed as commercially unviable became so commercially essential that Microsoft itself had no choice but to build a business around hosting it. Then there's mobile computing, a category that essentially didn't exist as a mass consumer product in 1999, and that ended up reshaping the entire technology industry more than the desktop ever did. Android, the operating system that eventually landed on billions of phones across the planet, making it arguably the single most used operating system in human history by raw device count, is built directly on top of the Linux kernel. Every swipe, every app, every notification on a huge share of the world's smartphones is, underneath the surface, running on the same open source foundation Gates once said could never scale into something businesses would trust. It never needed Microsoft's blessing or Microsoft's control to become the default computing platform for most of humanity. It just needed to be good enough, and it was. And then there's the one category almost nobody, on either side of this debate, ever expected Linux to seriously challenge: gaming. For decades, gaming meant Windows, full stop, no real argument necessary. The entire PC gaming industry, from the game engines developers built to the graphics drivers hardware makers wrote, was built around Windows as the default assumption. That started changing when Valve, the company behind the Steam gaming platform, built a compatibility layer called Proton specifically designed to let Windows-only games run smoothly on Linux, and then shipped that technology inside a handheld device called the Steam Deck. By early 2026, that compatibility layer supported the overwhelming majority of the top-selling titles on Steam, and Linux's measured share of the entire Steam platform had climbed past 5%, a number that would have sounded like pure science fiction to anyone in the industry a decade earlier. Point by point, category by category, the exact places Gates specifically said Linux would remain permanently weak, polish, hardware compatibility, and commercial viability became the very places it quietly, patiently, methodically won. None of that alone, though, would be enough to justify a video with this title, because servers and phones are one kind of victory, and the actual Windows desktop, the specific battlefield Gates was defending in that 1999 interview, held on for a remarkably long time after all of that happened. Even 5 years ago, Windows still ran on somewhere around 7 or 8 out of every 10 desktop and laptop computers worldwide. That is not a monopoly quietly crumbling under pressure. That is still, by any reasonable definition, a monopoly. So what actually changed? A lot of it traces back to a decision Microsoft made about its own product, not something Linux did to force the issue. When the company rolled out Windows 11, it attached hardware requirements far stricter than any previous version of Windows had ever demanded, most notably a mandatory TPM 2.0 security chip and a fairly recent generation of processor. Microsoft framed this as a necessary step forward for security, and there's a genuine argument to be made for that framing. But the practical effect was that it quietly locked out a staggering number of otherwise perfectly functional machines. Reporting from 2026 put the number of Windows 10 computers that simply cannot upgrade to Windows 11 at roughly 240 million worldwide. These aren't ancient, dying machines destined for the scrap heap anyway. Many are ordinary laptops and desktops built before around 2016 that work perfectly well for everyday tasks, email, browsing, word processing, but that lack one specific security chip Microsoft decided was now mandatory. Then came the deadline that turned that hardware wall into an actual crisis for millions of people. Microsoft ended free mainstream security support for Windows 10 in October of 2025. Consumers who want to keep receiving security patches after that point can pay for an extended security updates program. But even that only pushes the real deadline out to October of 2026. After that date, hundreds of millions of still working computers are left with a genuinely narrow set of choices. Buy an entirely new computer just to run Windows. 11. Pay Microsoft an ongoing fee to keep patching an operating system the company has already publicly declared obsolete. Or leave the Windows ecosystem behind entirely. For a steadily growing number of people and eventually entire institutions, that third option, leaving, stopped looking like a fringe move for hobbyists and started looking like the only option that actually made financial and practical sense. Why spend hundreds of dollars on new hardware or pay ongoing fees for security patches on an operating system Microsoft itself is actively walking away from, when a free, actively maintained alternative runs perfectly well on the exact same machine already sitting on the desk? In June of 2026, StatCounter, the analytics firm that has tracked global operating system usage for years and is generally treated as the industry's default source for this kind of data, published a number that immediately made headlines across the technology press. Windows had apparently fallen to roughly 56.5% of the global desktop market, dropping below the symbolic 60% line for the first time in years. Linux, meanwhile, climbed to one of its strongest measured positions ever recorded, edging past 4% worldwide. Now, in the interest of not repeating the exact mistake this whole video is about, overconfidence in a single confident sounding number, it's worth slowing down here and being precise because some analysts pushed back on that headline almost immediately after it started circulating. A meaningful chunk of that apparent drop, they pointed out, wasn't actually real users abandoning Windows overnight. It was partly a measurement quirk in how the data gets collected, driven by a growing category StatCounter labels as unknown, largely the result of privacy tools and browser extensions that deliberately mask what operating system a visitor is actually running. Strip that unknown category back out of the calculation, and Windows' real adjusted share looks meaningfully closer to 62% than 56%. But here's the part of the story that survives that fact check completely intact, and it's the part that actually matters for this video. Even using the more conservative methodology adjusted numbers, the underlying direction hasn't changed at all. Windows was sitting comfortably above 70% of the global desktop market just 2 years earlier. Linux has been on a slow, steady, genuinely multi-year climb, moving from under 3% a few years back to over 4% by the middle of 2026, and it has been climbing specifically because of the Windows 10 support cutoff and the hardware wall Microsoft itself chose to build. The single headline number might have been somewhat exaggerated by a data collection artifact. The trend sitting underneath that number is not, and every independent tracker measuring this space over the last 2 years points in the exact same direction. If individual users quietly switching operating systems on their own personal laptops is a trickle, what happened next was closer to a wave, and critically, it didn't come from hobbyists tinkering in their spare time. It came from national governments making deliberate, publicly announced policy decisions. In April of 2026, the French government announced what is likely one of the largest coordinated software migrations in the history of European public administration. The plan calls for moving 2.5 million civil servant computers off Windows entirely and onto Linux, coordinated through the country's own interministerial digital directorate. Critically, the plan didn't stop at simply swapping the operating system on the desktop. It extended to office productivity software, security and antivirus tools, and even the artificial intelligence platforms running on those government machines. Every single ministry across the French government was formally ordered to submit a concrete implementation plan by the autumn of 2026. And importantly, this wasn't a leap into the complete unknown for France. The country's national police force had already been quietly running a customized version of Ubuntu, one of the most popular Linux distributions, across more than 100,000 machines for nearly 2 decades before this larger national rollout was ever announced, giving French officials a genuinely proven track record to point to when critics questioned whether the plan was realistic. France wasn't operating in isolation either. Denmark's own Ministry of Digital Affairs moved to phase out both Windows and Microsoft's Office 365 subscription service, with officials explicitly framing the decision around what they called digital independence rather than simple cost savings. In Germany, the state government of Schleswig-Holstein committed to shifting roughly 30,000 government employees over to Linux and the LibreOffice productivity suite, and officials there were unusually direct about their reasoning, citing a specific desire to keep sensitive public data out of the legal reach of American surveillance law. And Germany as a country is currently sitting on a particularly striking version of this same underlying problem. Cybersecurity research published in early 2026 found that Windows 10 still runs on something close to half of all private consumer computers across the country, which translates to tens of millions of individual machines heading directly toward that October 2026 support cliff with no clear upgrade path already in place. The single word that keeps showing up again and again across the news coverage of these government decisions is sovereignty. For public institutions, the pitch behind these migrations increasingly isn't really about saving money on software licensing fees anymore, even though that's genuinely part of the calculation. It's about the discomfort of having a country's critical public infrastructure depend entirely on product decisions made inside the boardroom of a single foreign company thousands of miles away. And there's a kind of snowball effect built into decisions like this. Once one major national government successfully completes a migration like this without the sky falling, it hands the next government real political cover to attempt the same thing, and suddenly a niche policy idea that would have sounded fringe in 2019 becomes a 2.5 million machine national migration by 2026. It would honestly be a little intellectually lazy to end this story by simply declaring Bill Gates a fool, because that's not really an accurate summary of what actually happened here. And a channel built around getting history right shouldn't flatten a genuinely complicated, multi-decade story down into a cheap, satisfying dunk just because it makes for a better thumbnail. Gates' underlying warning about fragmentation, specifically, wasn't crazy at all, and it still isn't entirely wrong today. Anyone who has ever tried to help a relative troubleshoot a driver problem on an unfamiliar Linux distribution knows firsthand that the ecosystem can still feel meaningfully less unified than Windows does. There are genuinely dozens of major Linux distributions in active use, competing desktop environments with different visual styles and conventions, and inconsistent hardware support in certain specific niches, which is more or less exactly the kind of fragmentation Gates warned about back in that 1999 interview. What Gates actually got wrong wasn't his diagnosis of the problem. It was the conclusion he confidently drew from that diagnosis. He assumed that fragmentation would ultimately be fatal to Linux's commercial prospects, that without one single company controlling the entire roadmap, the way Microsoft controlled Windows, the software could never mature into something serious businesses and national governments would ever trust with critical infrastructure. Instead, more or less the exact opposite ended up happening. The absence of a single corporate owner became one of the software's biggest selling points rather than its fatal flaw. Governments genuinely worried about foreign surveillance don't actually want their national infrastructure owned and controlled by a company headquartered in another country. Developers and IT departments burned by sudden hardware lockouts don't want their next operating system to have the built-in power to obsolete perfectly good computers by unilateral corporate decision. The very chaos and lack of central control that Gates warned would doom the project quietly turned, over 27 years, into a genuine form of independence, and by 2026, that independence looks a lot less like a weakness and a lot more like the entire point. It's also worth being honest that Windows' current struggles aren't purely a story about Linux getting better. A meaningful part of this story is Microsoft doing real, self-inflicted damage to its own reputation along the way. Windows 11's rollout has been dogged for years by user complaints about intrusive advertising built directly into the operating system, aggressive prompts pushing people toward Microsoft's own services, and a steady stream of monthly updates that have, on more than one occasion, introduced new bugs into systems that were previously working perfectly fine. None of that alone would be enough to meaningfully dent a monopoly this size on its own. But combined with a hardware wall that locks out working machines, a hard deadline that leaves millions of people with no comfortable path forward, and a free, increasingly capable alternative sitting right there waiting for them, all those individually survivable annoyances start to add up into something that actually moves the needle on a chart that hadn't meaningfully moved in decades. There's also a slower, quieter version of the same story happening inside businesses, away from the headlines about national governments. Small and mid-sized companies running older office hardware are facing exactly the same math that individual consumers are facing, except multiplied across dozens or hundreds of machines at once. For a company with 100 aging desktops that can't take Windows 11, the choice isn't abstract. It's a real line item on a budget, either a six-figure hardware refresh, an ongoing subscription cost to keep an obsolete operating system patched, or a migration project onto something free. Departments that would never have seriously entertained a Linux desktop rollout a decade ago are now running pilot programs, precisely because the alternative costs are no longer hypothetical. None of this shows up as dramatically in a headline as a national government migration does, but multiplied across enough companies, it's part of the same underlying current pulling the desktop numbers in the same direction. And it's worth zooming out for a second on just how different the world of 2026 is from the world Gates was operating in when he made that original comment. In 1999, the idea of a national government worrying about a foreign company's control over its computing infrastructure barely registered as a mainstream political concern. Data sovereignty wasn't yet a phrase most policymakers used. Cloud computing, in the form we know it today, didn't exist. The entire framework that makes Linux's current advantages so appealing to a government in 2026, independence from a single foreign vendor, freedom from surveillance law, jurisdiction, freedom from being locked out of your own hardware by a corporate decision, simply wasn't part of the conversation in the courtroom where Gates made his comment. He wasn't just wrong about Linux technical trajectory. He was answering a question shaped entirely by the concerns of 1999, in a world that would eventually be reshaped by concerns nobody in that courtroom was seriously discussing yet. So did Bill Gates actually get proven wrong? Yes, but slowly, unevenly, and for reasons that took a full quarter century of internet infrastructure build-out. Mobile computing's rise, corporate hardware decisions made by his own former company, and shifting global geopolitics to fully play out. That is rarely how these stories get told online, because it's so much easier to clip a confident soundbite from 1999 next to a dramatic headline from 2026 and call it a finished story. But the honest, complete version is genuinely more interesting anyway. A monopoly that looked completely unbreakable in that Washington courtroom in 1999 is now facing a government-led exodus across multiple countries, a hardware wall of its own making locking out hundreds of millions of working machines, and a slow but very real erosion of the one number that mattered most to Gates back then, the actual desktop. Windows is not dead. It isn't even remotely close to dead. It remains, by a wide margin, the single most used desktop operating system on planet Earth, and that isn't going to change anytime soon. But no threat was never going to survive intact contact with the year 2026. If you want to see the next chapter of this story play out, specifically what actually happens when those 240 million locked out PCs hit that October 2026 deadline with genuinely nowhere left to go, that video is already in the works. Subscribe if you don't want to miss it, and let me know in the comments whether you think Microsoft can actually turn this around before that deadline hits.